Welcome to The Technology Pill, a podcast that looks at how technology is reshaping our lives every day and exploring the different ways that governments and companies use tech to increase their power. My name is Gus Hossain, and I'm the Executive Director at Privacy International.
And I'm Caitlin, and I'm PI Senior Campaigns Officer. Hi.
Today, I am on the other side of the table.
You are.
We actually literally are in the same room.
Very unusually,
and sitting at opposite ends of the table, but I am now closing my computer and I am Caitlin's guest.
Yes, because this week, the third week in a row, we're talking about encryption.
Oh, God.
Which Gus hates talking about, which is unfortunate for Gus, because Gus is one of our resident experts on encryption and has been working on encryption since the 90s.
Yes.
Since before I was born.
Oh, shut up. Okay. Now I'm wondering if for the rest of this podcast, you have to call me either Dr. Gus or Mr. Gus.
Wouldn't it be Dr. Hossain? Yeah. Is it like Lewis Hamilton is only a Sir if you do his full name? It's Sir Lewis Hamilton or it's Sir Lewis. It's never Sir Hamilton.
Interesting.
Because that's the way that Sirs work. And the only way I know that is because of Lewis Hamilton. But no, Dr. Hossain, with your various degrees in mathematics.
Yeah.
So we've done a podcast on what encryption is.
Yeah.
We've done a podcast on modern day arguments about encryption because we did one on Pachasov versus Russia, the case you heard about last month. And this week is how do we get here? And I asked around the tech team to get a list of things to ask you about.
Oh, okay.
And they gave me some of which they're just words to me. So we'll see how this goes. So encryption has obviously been around a very long time, but the major kind of last time that there were significant political arguments about it is kind of called the Cryptowars. Yes. Is that fair?
Yes.
What is the Cryptowars?
Yeah, and for people of your generation, the idea that there's a crypto anything, you don't associate necessarily with cryptography.
You call encryption crypto, and you say the word crypto, and every time I have to take a second to translate it because you mean encryption, cryptography.
Yes, exactly.
And I hear
coins,
blockchain, which is a very different vibe, I would say. Yeah. They're related.
They're
not that related.
No, very different people. Yeah, famously, Matt Blaze is a researcher in the US who was at AT&T, and now he's at one of the universities, a great computer scientist. During the crypto wars, he set up the domain crypto.com. Might be crypto.org, but one or the other. And it became a resource for all encryption policy related issues. And he's one of the best minds at it. And apparently he keeps on getting harassed by the crypto boys who say, why are you sitting on this website? Why are you sitting on this domain? This should be ours because it's our issue now. And he's one of the great elders. The fact that that's actually happening blows my mind. But yeah, okay. Encryption and encrypto wars. The crypto wars essentially have existed since the Second World War.
Okay.
When at the end of the war, the governments got together and said, we're going to regulate the flow of technology so that weapons don't flow freely. And from that comes the Wassenaar Convention. And importantly, math was added to that convention.
It's like nuclear weapons.
Exactly.
Maths.
Yeah. Yes. So the International Trade in Arms Regulations, ITAR, includes that encryption technology shall not be transferred without having some form of controls. And it's because the Second World War had just been won on the back of who was able to crack whose codes. What happened between that Second World War and the 1980s was banking, essentially.
Right.
And banks had to start to network and they had to secure their networks. And that's when you saw standards emerge around encryption. Like America had its DES, its data encryption standard, which was a relatively strong encryption standard at the time. But what then happened in the 80s and 90s was that the internet started taking off and common people, you weren't even born, so I can't even point to you, like common people like you and me, but let's say common people like me had computing resources, wanted to communicate. And there's this thing called the internet, and we needed a form of security for it, but we weren't allowed to because this internet was a global resource. The rules were encryption could only be used domestically unless you were in France, at which point you couldn't even use it domestically. And so a war broke out as to who could have security and who couldn't. But what the war really was about was how secure will our world be, and who gets to have a say over that.
What were the major skirmishes?
The biggest conflict actually existed within the intelligence agency of the United States government called the National Security Agency, because their job is, they have two jobs actually. Their first job is to make sure that they can exploit the world's communications to the advantage of the US government and the taxpayer, I guess. Their second job, though, is to make sure that the US people are protected from surveillance of others.
Right.
And so in the 1970s, when the encryption standard was being developed openly, it's a public process because America's a free country, the proposal that was being put forward got reviewed by the NSA.
Right.
And the NSA made some tiny tweaks to it, and nobody could figure out why they made those tweaks to it until like 15 years later when they realized actually the NSA made the standard stronger.
Oh, interesting.
Because they were trying to protect Americans.
Right.
But that existed at a time where that technology wasn't going to be exported to the French or the Germans, the British, and others.
Right.
So they could do that. So then the key skirmish occurred in the early 90s when the voice telecommunications network, the telephone system for easier terms, started to become digital. And it occurred to the Department of Justice, that is the policing side of the US government, that people might want to start using digital communications, voice, and that they might start using encryption. And so they went to the NSA and told the NSA, hey, why don't you work with us that will create a standard for all telephones across America that they can be encrypted, except for when we need to have access to it under law, blah, blah, blah. And so the NSA developed what we now know called the Clipper chip. And this was a chip that was going to go into every phone in America that allowed for, if not for me and you, because I'm American, you're non-American, so I wouldn't be able to speak to you, but if I was speaking to my next door neighbor in America, our phones would connect using this chip and we'd have a secure communication that the governments of France or Israel or Iran could not listen into. But at a flip of a switch, the American government could, because it was designed by the NSA with essentially what we would imagine as a backdoor for the Department of Justice, for the FBI, let's say.
So was it a backdoor in terms of like, we can get into it because the maths has a problem that we just hope no one notices? Or is it literally like a switch, this conversation is no longer encrypted?
It's something along those lines of the second.
Right.
So again, it's an open standard. Everybody had to see it. And that's where we go back to Matt Blaze being this researcher at AT&T. He got access to the technology because it's a piece of chip, and he started to analyze it, and he actually found a flaw. And that undermined the Clipper chip as a secure device. And it's that beautiful moment. Hackers can undermine policy in the most beautiful way. But it was this idea, and to use another example to explain the type of workarounds they were thinking, going back to this idea that encryption is an arm, a form of munitions that cannot be exported, they eventually decided that because American industry wanted to be the best in the world, that they would allow some exports. And there was one system developed by Lotus that was sold to the Swedish government that had encryption built in. But within the code, and when they analyzed the code, they could see that encryption keys were encoded, and there were a certain length, there were a certain strength, but an element of the key was called the NSA key, which meant the NSA had access, had a way of reducing the amount of effort it would take them to decrypt those communications. And it was hard-coded or soft-coded into the system. And when the Swedish government woke up and saw that in their code, there's something called the NSA key, and it's like, what the hell? And it didn't mean that the NSA was listening. It wasn't like a back door in that they were hacking in, which I'm sure there was other back doors they could do that to. But it was a back door in the sense that it reduced the amount of effort required
to hack it.
And the effort is mathematical and computation based. And we now know the NSA has vast amounts of computational power. So it would be like a flip of a switch for them to be able to decrypt. Whereas for you and I, again, you weren't alive at the time, you and I decrypt would be vast amounts of effort.
So something Ed, actually, from our last podcast, mentioned to me the other day is that apparently the NSA has like this massive warehouse somewhere in America where they store loads of currently encrypted communications in the hope of one day being able to like decrypt them. I don't really know what my question is. I guess it's like, is that legit? Does that sound right?
It would make sense for an intelligence agency to always be doing that calculation of what they're capable of doing now versus what computing will do for them in the future. And they've hated the last 30 years where for the first time in their existence, there were things they didn't have access to. So it was easier just to hold on to it and wait for their computing power to catch up. I would still imagine that their computing capacity, whether it is pure brute capacity or computational innovations, that they are ahead of many others. And so they would be able to decrypt communications that the common person with their computing resources or even a smaller government or an average government couldn't. So it makes complete sense that they would be holding on to these things to then make sense of the past.
Because Ed was talking about Signal, the encrypted messaging thing, have already implemented like anti-quantum computing standards. And he said that that's partly because things like the NSA keeping it in the hope that things like quantum computing, then they can go back and read currently encrypted messages.
Yeah, and so a number of organizations are implementing that quantum computing safeguard now, which is incredible level of foresight. I think that's, we're so much further down the road than we were 30 years ago on these debates. Because 30 years ago, the idea of us having access to encryption was unthinkable to most governments. And to most people, they wouldn't even know where to begin with this stuff. The fact that we're at this point now imagining, not just imagining, but implementing in our real day systems protections for encryption for computing that doesn't exist yet, that's extraordinary. But it's important to remember that in the 1990s, none of this existed. And there was this moment where governments thought that they could determine the code. They could determine the math that you were allowed to use. There was even one guy who had tattooed code on his arm that in theory, he would need the permission of the US government to travel because it was encryption and he was traveling with encryption capacity, like the instructions to do encryption on his arm. And he did it provocatively because it's like, you can't tell me I can't travel. But the government was saying, well, that technically is ammunition. And it got so ridiculous at one point, people were adding to their email signatures encryption code, literally like software code on how to do encryption, because it got to the point where you'd have to report to the Department of Commerce every time you're leaving the country with encryption. So they thought, let me just CC the Department of Commerce every time I'm sending a message, because it's like, clearly this doesn't make sense. But at the birth of the internet as we know it in the 1990s, there was this very huge uncertainty whether or not governments would control the means to communicating or not.
So to go back before I got distracted to the NSA key, what did the Swedish government do?
They got really angry. And then Lotus got really angry. And then all of the large software houses got really angry because they were willing to abide by these rules and secretly embed these types of systems. But when they were outed and it then became, oh, you can't trust American software, then something had to change. And that's when the rules started to become a little bit more liberal. So if you think about it, if you were somebody at Microsoft, and part of my PhD is I went and worked with researchers at Microsoft, but also the coders at Microsoft. So if you were developing Internet Explorer versus Netscape, you develop it, you put it on the Netscape website, and people around the world could download because it's free and open source. If it was Internet Explorer, you'd have to create a version for Americans. You'd have to create a version for Canadians, well, English-speaking Canadians and French-speaking Canadians. You'd have to invent a version for friendly American countries, non-friendly American countries, and France, which was different than the French-Canadian because France banned encryption altogether. Because France was just always so stupid at these things. And so that was horrible. And we're not just saying language, we're talking about the inner codes. And for the salespeople at these companies, they'd have to be saying, like when a French company, or let's say a German company, or the Swedish government say, why aren't we getting the same version as your American customers? And they say, oh, it's the American government that won't let us. That became a problem. And that's when more business-friendly organizations like the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which sounds really developmenty, but really it's the rich governments club, they started to take much more progressive stances on encryption, saying, look, we're about to face this thing called e-commerce. We need a secure e-commerce infrastructure, so we need to rethink all these types of controls we have. The French and the British were the last to let go of that rich government club, but they eventually had to.
So it was really the reason that I guess we kind of won was more to do with economics and business than it was to do with morals and freedom of speech and liberal kind
and so the reason why people who are in our sector love the crypto wars because they think that we won it.
Right.
And they think that we won it with all these clever little things like tattooing yourself or CCing the Department of Commerce, or more importantly, the launch of Pretty Good Privacy, PGP, being an open source application developed by Phil Zimmerman in the early to mid 90s that accidentally or incidentally or something happened that it got published on the internet and people anywhere in the world could download. And so to the internet libertarians, of which I was one in the 1990s, because everybody was, if they were in this field, thought this is just proof that governments have no control anymore. Bill got prosecuted because he broke the law, but even though he didn't, but his code ended up accessible to terrorists and French people alike. And so it was at that same point where you had thinkers saying, oh, the internet sees censorship as damage and roots around it. So the internet sees government's attempt to control how you communicate as damage and just roots around it. So we like to believe that it was our will to be free is what allowed encryption to happen. But really, and this is where I'm a nerd because I did my PhD on encryption policy and encryption regulation, it did come down to key policy fights, and the will to be free was an element of it, but really it was about how difficult it was for governments to regulate in this new environment and the need to secure our communications. But it got crazy before it actually solved itself. Like it got to the point in the UK where the government accepted that people were going to use whatever encryption they wanted. They were going to use PGP if they had to. But they said, if you're going to do that, we're going to make it a requirement that you give us your secret key. And we were saying, that's the dumbest idea ever. We're not going to give our keys to the government. They said, okay, well, yeah, we can see the problem there. So we're going to create something called a trusted third party. And they're going to hold on to it. And it's like, we're not going to trust what you call a trusted third party. And then they said, okay, well, what if it's your grocery store instead? And it's like, God. Are you serious? Like, I have to update my grocery store every time I change my keys? And it's going to be illegal for me to not do that? Like, what the hell? And then that was also happening at a time where we're finally recognizing that encryption isn't just about confidentiality. It's about certifying that we know who we are and that the messages haven't been altered. And once that started to take off as an idea, then integrity of communications became a priority and governments weren't able to stop that flow.
Well, I hadn't realized, and one of the things that I've talked about and I hadn't realized at all is that encryption is part of how, and hashing specifically, is part of how your computer knows a software update's legit.
Exactly.
And I had no idea. Yeah. I had no idea how frequently I interact with encryption, because obviously I know I do on WhatsApp and on Signal, and I know I do on password storage and hashing there, and I know I do in my browser, but I had absolutely no idea that every time, like, you know, my phone nags me about a software update, which obviously I instantly do because I have very good security hygiene.
Yeah, of course.
I had no idea encryption was involved in that.
But what's funny is that in the 1990s, we often had to sell encryption because of that second use, which is that's how you can trust what it is you're engaging with. Because we were worried we'd lose the public if we were talking about hiding your communications from the government. Because isn't that just what pornographers and drug dealers do and terrorists? This is pre-9/11, of course. And so at that time, I think the dominant discourse in general public was about trust in the digital age. Now it's completely upside down, which is people forget it's about trust and it's actually about confidentiality.
Back to encrypted messaging apps, which is the predominant way in which people deliberately engage with encrypted.
And that's where WhatsApp did this huge, beautiful public education exercise that every time you start a chat, it says these terms end-to-end encryption.
Yeah.
Never thought that that would be so mainstream as it is today.
No. And I remember deliberately being like, before WhatsApp really took off and before things were encrypted, being told, oh, you know, use, at the time it would have been Telegram and then it would have been Signal. Use them because if you use them, the dissidents using them in like, you know, the Arab world or in China, if you're using it to talk to your parents, then it gives them cover because the use of the app is not in and of itself suspicious.
Absolutely. And the idea of governments trying to shut down that app would be shutting you down from talking to your parents.
Exactly. Yeah. And so it was a much more deliberate choice. Now it's like default, everyone uses WhatsApp.
And you just, young people like you just don't recognize that there was a moment in time where that was not going to be the case.
Yeah.
It was unimaginable that you would have secure communications, military grade, as the faux advertising always says, military grade encryption. And the thought that you now have quantum ready encryption that you use without an afterthought to communicate with like our dog walker, you know, like what the hell? That's just extraordinary. And it's because of the really hard crypto war fights in the 1990s.
Literally my list goes 90s and the crypto wars, clipper chips, which is quite funny. And the other thing that Ed found so funny was the idea of making like maths illegal, because maths is not like other things in that it is completely independently discoverable, which is what happened, right, with the Diffie-Hellman. If you can't remember what Diffie-Hellman is, listener, then it's the color thing that Ed was talking about, whereby it got discovered by Diffie and Hellman, but it had been discovered before and the government had just kept quiet about it in the hope that no one else noticed. It was a fundamental principle of how the world and also numbers work.
Yeah, which really, really sucks that the UK government had discovered a new way of doing things securely. And rather than tell everybody so that we could all be more secure, or even just tell the British people so they could be more secure, they just kept it to themselves. And then some hippies in the 1970s, just a few years later, maybe 3 years later, discovered it. And that's Diffie and Hellman, and independently Ralph Merkle. And then they published it in an American academic publication. And then all of a sudden everybody had access to it. And the British were just so stupid. Why did they have to do that? But yeah, you're right. It's all math and it's all discoverable. So the idea of saying that there's some math that you're not allowed to use is based on this idea that there are very bright mathematicians working for our secret agency who are going to be the custodians of that knowledge, and nobody else is going to have that knowledge. And so we have to be careful who we teach math to. And to be frank, we did become very careful who we taught math to. If you were a professor at a university in the UK teaching encryption, you had to make sure there were no foreign students in your class. And again, that was the world up until the 1990s, that governments could determine what is taught. They could determine what was in the code on your machines. They could determine the chips in your phones. Because of losing this, because of these ideas such as what Ed covered, that you can't, it's math, it's discoverable, you can't regulate math, we were able to chip away at this sense of control, like entitlement of control that governments felt, and they recognized that they could no longer do that. So if you told an American today that the Department of Justice wants to put a chip in your phone, could you imagine their response? Versus 30 years ago, we had a hard time getting people to care.
Wow, that's crazy. And then France just banned it. France were just
stupid. Like France was one of the only Western governments on the planet that regulated what French people could do. So the Americans said, we don't want the rest of the world to have strong encryption, but our people can. Our banks need it and our politicians need it, blah, blah, blah. The British just counted on the fact that there were so few computers. And they said, oh, but we have the best mathematicians, so nobody can be bothered. And our telephone system here sucks. But France had developed its own networking technology, its own computing system. And they thought the French government mandated solutions were sufficient. And if anybody wanted to deviate beyond the Minitel system and whatnot, they needed permission, individual level permission. And you weren't going to get it. So it was banned.
I'd forgotten about Minitel.
Yeah.
There was a whole, back when, what's the podcast called? It's dead now. It doesn't exist anymore. reply all existed. They did a whole episode of Minitel operators, and I'd never heard of it. And the idea of there being a French-specific alternate kind of internet blew my mind, because isn't it just like in complete opposition to the whole purpose of the internet?
I know, but again, this is the 1990s that all determined these things. I remember when Canada has this rule that on Canadian TV and Canadian radio, X percentage of the content that's transmitted has to be Canadian. Has to be Canadian programming, Canadian bands, Canadian music professionals. And they had this moment in time asking, well, should we mandate the same thing for the internet?
Oh my God.
Which is unthinkable. But back then, when I celebrated the fact that they weren't going to do it, a friend of mine said, but that sucks. Eh? And he wasn't wrong. And because you remember that classic line in history about early in the telephone era, when one of the geniuses of the telephone era was saying, I think he was speaking to somebody in Texas, now you can speak to somebody in, let's say, Idaho. And the person said, well, why would I want to speak to somebody in Idaho? And so there was a moment, a very long time in history, where somebody in France would say, why would I want to speak to somebody outside of France? They didn't even speak my language. Now it's unthinkable.
Yes, well, there is a French language bureau who get very annoyed every time a loan word comes up, and they're normally internet-y loan words.
Yeah.
Email.
Courriel is what I learned. It was the proper way of putting it.
Well, how was it?
Courriel.
Courriel.
Yeah, it's like C-O-U-R, like run, E-L, I-E-L. Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
That's really funny.
Yeah. I grew up with French Canadians.
Fair enough. Yes, my language skills are somewhere between dire and abysmal. The next thing on my list is GPS spatial resolution restrictions and subsequent changes. So the global positioning system of satellites used to have a civilian and a military version.
Yeah.
I don't know why it's on my list of things to ask about in relation to encryption. I think it's to do with military and non-military maths.
I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction, which is, what are the capabilities of your phones and who determines them?
Right.
So let me use the example of GPS. And I don't know the state of play now, but when I was studying this was interesting, which is, if you build GPS capacity into a computing device, phones didn't necessarily have it at the time, but they were starting to, because this is in the early 2000s. You could do so in America, and that phone can be used in many places in the world, but that phone could not be sold in Egypt. Because the whole idea that a phone in Egypt can access GPS was unimaginable to Egyptian authorities. So how do you design a piece of tech with hardware that works in some places and doesn't work in others? And the Cryptowars is an instantiation of that. So the phones that were being built, so the smartphones that were starting to use new standards like GSM at the time, GSM had an element of encryption built into it. And GSM was a standard across Europe, but also a little bit in America and some networks. And GSM had an encryption standard, A5, and A5/1, A5/2, different forms of encryption. And what researchers eventually found was that the encryption keys in A5/1 were quite long, but a large amount of it had been zeroed out. And so here you had a piece of hardware operating with other pieces of hardware, being the mobile telecommunications system, that supposedly had encryption on it, had encryption protection zeroed out. Then it was discovered that at a network level, this can be flipped on at a switch. So say there was a public protest taking place in the main town square. At a network level, you can flip a switch and reduce the level of encryption on all devices in that area. And again, this idea that governments, whether it's the Egyptian government saying you can't bring your GPS phone into this country, or you cannot sell your GPS phone in this country, or all of a sudden the hardware being zeroed out on your device, that was a level of control that governments had.
Wait, so I'm going to sound like either a complete asshole or just a normal human being, but Tahrir Square was the massive Egyptian protest, right? So you would walk into Tahrir Square and then the encryption on your phone would stop working.
Yeah. That's what they could do with the GSM standard if they were talking on the phones. It's different than what the internet allowed, which was you can connect to Facebook, if we're going back to that
Right,
era.
yes.
So in theory, your HTTPS connection to Facebook should have been secure. But let's remember, at that era, Facebook said encryption's too expensive to implement.
Yeah.
So there was no HTTPS for Facebook. And so everything at the internet layer on your mobile phone was unencrypted, and everything at the voice layer of your mobile phone was forcibly unencrypted. So one was because the company was too lazy in making too much money, being Facebook, and one was because governments had conspired with the telecommunications providers to make sure that people didn't have security.
That's wild.
Yeah.
So it was just like all cell sites, like towers, within X range of X place no longer provide encryption.
Yeah.
Which I suppose is not that dissimilar to geofencing that you can do now with ad tech, whereby now it wouldn't be my phone is entered into this dead zone for encryption, but rather I have entered into a geographically bound area in which my data is being collected and tagged and sold.
Great example, because what you're describing is that, first, I'm explaining that in the 1990s, governments had control.
Yes.
Down to the hardware level and the code that you could run. There was this really strange period in the 2000s where nobody had security, everybody could have access, but in theory you could have encryption because the crypto wars had moved on, but terrorism had descended and big tech started to emerge. But because of big tech emerging, they found that their model of surveillance capitalism was going to make them trillionaires. And intelligence agencies shifted from the, oh, we hate crypto era to the, let's do mass surveillance because we have all this unencrypted communications, but also let's have some fun with this surveillance capitalism and find ways to exploit all these devices and all these communication systems globally. And so they end up using ad tech. This is what Snowden showed us. So they were using ad tech capacities to conduct surveillance because they found, oh, despite all this encryption, there's all these great ways of surveilling people. So this explains the 2010s, essentially, which is surveillance capitalism and intelligence gathering coexisting in this beautiful, horrible place for us. And now, in the late 2010s, things started to change, where WhatsApp, iMessage, Signal everywhere. And you could say 2016 was a key moment in time because that's when liberals started to care about these things, but Arab uprising was setting this all up. And the Snowden disclosures were absolutely key, even though industry keeps on saying, oh, we were going to do it anyways. No, they weren't. We were going around yelling at industry saying, turn on encryption. And they kept on saying it's too expensive. Oh, you don't understand. It's going to slow down the internet for people who need it. F off. People need secure encryption because they're going to get in trouble from their government, as we saw with the Arab uprising. And so, yeah, eventually where we got to say 2018, 2019, encryption being turned on, things started to get relatively good, but that's when you start hearing about NSO Group and hacking and exploiting mobile phones. And then you realize that there's a whole new layer of insecurity that's emerging. Unfair to say 2018. Anorax will say, well, that was started with FinFisher in 2012 and all that. But the whole idea of exploitability of systems at a consumer level, that came in after.
People love NSA Group. And they're kind of nerds, you're right, love FinFisher. But like individual phone hacking using advanced systems like that is great. But it is a very small percentage of people that ever will get hacked by those systems, and they're specifically normally targeted. Whereas there's a huge volume of people whose data gets collected and sold on, sometimes to governments by ad tech companies, and a huge, probably slightly smaller, but a large volume of people who have such rubbish, cruddy, crap phones that fell out of software support before they even bought them, who it completely wide open to any kind of, completely non-fancy hack. And we went to the Philippines before COVID, so a long time ago now, it feels like, and spoke to a human rights group. And they weren't so worried about NSO Group. They were worried because all of their volunteers across the Philippines had crap Androids with old Android software. And they were trying to get some money together to buy newer phones that weren't out of software support. It's the NSO Group thing. Like, I get why we care about it, because it matters and it's important. And it's normally journalists and human rights defenders that get targeted. But it drives me crazy that people think it's the only thing.
Yeah, exactly.
The only way of getting around this stuff.
Exactly. And so for listeners, you have to understand that Caitlin has played an extraordinary role in making sure that this gets heard as an issue and gets addressed, which is that people using low-cost technology are not less deserving of security. That firms that sell technology must make sure that technology is secure and maintained for a period of time for people. And that reminds me, when FinFisher first came out, a number of very important people around the world got in touch with us saying, hey, we work with very targeted populations who are hated by their governments. Can you come and scan their devices to make sure that they don't have FinFisher on it? And when we would go and scan their devices, we would find that no, there's no FinFisher, but there's also no password on this operating system. This operating system they're using is also very old. And by the way, it's Microsoft, so it's vastly leaky to begin with. And it's like, can you not focus on the sexy thing and focus on the less sexy thing, which is, can we raise the bar on security generally?
Or the government owns a telecommunication firm. And if your communications aren't encrypted and the government is looking at the telecommunication firm's data, then it doesn't really matter.
It doesn't, and even if it is encrypted in some countries, like I think it was Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, where the government was introducing its own layer of encryption. They were reintroducing the certificates so that they could intercept everything in the middle. Extraordinary. But yeah, exactly. And so that's why we try to focus on the more systemic level. But that's only possible because, and this is where I'll give the NSO group fans a lot of credit, which is it has forced industry to up its game.
Yeah.
Like in my lifetime of working on these issues, one of the moments where I got a chill up my spine of a beautiful nature was when I saw the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto had released a report saying there was a vulnerability that was being exploited on phones across the world, and Apple issuing an update to 1 billion devices at the same time because of that vulnerability. To me, like, that was one of the key moments in our history, which was a large company improving the security of billions of devices because a small group of very smart people had identified that this was a vulnerability for people. But that was a moment in time because we were just accustomed up until then to software being out of date, vulnerabilities being ignored, and vulnerabilities actually being harvested by bad actors who were going to have fun with it. We're in a better place now because of that.
So that kind of brings us up to modern times. And in modern times, one of the more dramatic things that has happened recently was a news story called Encryption, which is around a collection of quote-unquote encrypted phones, which was supposed to be super secret. They could only talk to other people with the same phone. They were supposed to have a crazy level of security, and people were buying them to essentially run, amongst other things, drugs gangs. The problem for those people was EncroChat turned out to be developed and sold by law enforcement agencies in a massive sting operation. I think it's interesting for two reasons. One is it really demonstrates the idea of security by obscurity is really stupid. It used to be you'd hear it a lot from Mac users. When I was a kid, the main reason anyone ever told me to get a Mac is like, they're so secure. It's like, why are they so secure? No one uses them. It's security through obscurity because there's no point in trying to hack them, which is bizarre. Anyway, so the idea of having the super secret phone, which is just for your criminal activity, as compared to the WhatsApp example where it's like, everyone should use this to give cover to the people using it because they're dissidents. And it's also interesting because it's similar to the Clipper chip stuff while also being not similar.
Yeah.
And I don't...
So everything you're talking about is again, rooted in the history. So it's in the late 80s and early 90s. So first at the math level. I almost said maths. I almost said maths.
We're infecting you.
Going native here. At the math level, there's this wonderful principle developed by a French mathematician called Kirchhoff. And this is in the late 1800s that he said, no method of creating security should rely on the secrecy of the method in order to ensure that security, which is, no, there should be no such thing as security through obscurity, which means all encryption standards and all encryption methods should be openly available and should be auditable. People should be able to see the code, and the secrecy that emerges from using that shouldn't be hidden within the code. It should be as a result of that code properly being run. So that's the idea that we need to have openly available cryptography. But if cryptography is a secret, then it relies on obscurity. To use the example of, in the 90s, it was discovered that there was a company called Crypto.ag, a Swiss company that was providing encryption services around the world, that was operating at this level where they were essentially providing services to governments who really shouldn't have been allowed to have encryption, if there was this idea of good governments and bad governments shouldn't have encryption.
Right.
Lo and behold, it was discovered that Crypto.ag, AG being the registration of a company in Switzerland, was actually set up by US intelligence agencies. So it was their way of providing insecure cryptography to governments and allowing the American government access to it throughout. It was a brilliant scheme because it was at a time where the monopoly of knowledge on encryption existed within governments. So if they set up this nefarious company that everybody, like if you were in law enforcement, you probably hated Crypto.ag. You didn't realize that the guys down the street who run the intelligence agency were right in bed with them. But once cryptography became liberalized and this idea that you shouldn't have security through obscurity, so the code should be available and all that, a new layer of paranoia set in, which is, I'm not going to use pretty good privacy, PGP. That's just pretty good. I want military-grade privacy. Or I'm not going to use WhatsApp. That's what idiots use who trust Mark Zuckerberg with their security. I'm going to use, oh, look, some guy's selling me this really hyper-secure phone and this hyper-secure EncroChat. I'm going to use that. And governments, law enforcement agencies always rely on this instinct we have that everybody else are a bunch of plebs. I'm smarter than everybody else. I'm going to use this system that some guy I shouldn't be trusting told me to use, and that's the exact system that they're exploiting, which was the Crypto.ag model.
Which in some ways makes a lot of sense. And I also completely understand the instinct to go, well, the maths, it's like out there. Anyone can look at it, so surely it's less secure than one no one can look at.
But it comes back to that story I'm telling you about DES. When the data encryption standard was being developed and the NSA interfered with it, everybody thought that the NSA had interfered with it to undermine it because there was a lack of trust in the NSA. Lo and behold, the NSA made it stronger for good reason.
Yeah.
And so the lack of trust in all of this domain was engendered by this 1945 to 1995, let's say, period that we're still recovering from. And that's why we have all these attitudes and all this insecurity that still emerges.
And like, it is justified to not trust Mark Zuckerberg. And it's justified, even though the contents of your messages are encrypted on WhatsApp, who you're messaging when and the metadata that goes with your messages is not encrypted. Yeah. So it's not like Mark Zuckerberg doesn't know you text your mum while you were in a supermarket. It's just that Mark Zuckerberg doesn't know you texted about brands of
Exactly. And the additional reason we shouldn't trust Mark Zuckerberg is that it's still unclear to anybody how WhatsApp is going to make money.
Right.
Instagram makes bucket loads of money by knowing exactly what you're posting and who you're following and what you're consuming. Facebook does the exact same thing. WhatsApp being encrypted and the way that it works means it's not making any money for Mark now. Mark's got to find a way to exploit that data to make money off it. And that's why there's this reticence around, okay, when are they going to screw up WhatsApp?
I don't know, Mark Zuckerberg's pretty good at doing things that don't make any money. Yeah. I mean, he's really obsessed with the metaverse. And although that has you can see ultimately where money should come from, which is like tracking your eyeball movements and other super fun things. Selling games as well, but probably less so. To be fair, you can't see that with WhatsApp, but he has poured a lot of money into things that don't make any money.
And for him, the metaverse was a clipper chip attempt, which was right now we're about to, or we have lost control of the stack. Right. Of like, Apple's telling us we can't do this and this operating system telling us we can't do that. We want to reestablish that stack and own it. And the clipper chip was that ability to get in front of this move to digital communications and to make sure that all digital communications in the future for the FBI were insecure. This is what Mark was trying to do with, I say Mark as if I'm friends with him, but that was what he was doing by creating their own device.
Yeah.
That they could control, that nobody can come along and say, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't track people from this website to that website, from that app to this app, you can't track their eyeballs.
I never thought about it that way, but that is extremely interesting and also disturbing.
Yeah, the metaverse came up in Facebook at a time when Facebook got royally screwed by Apple with the app tracking.
Yeah. Huh.
And so this is the end of the conversation in many ways. Like the conversation began in the 1980s and 90s when governments had control and were trying to maintain control. Then we had this post-2000 era of like, okay, governments are losing control, but big tech doesn't want to encrypt anything, secure anything because it costs too much, and they want to be able to exploit, to the stories of the 2010s when that was a bad world. We need to make things better. And now you have companies behaving like governments in the 1990s, saying, I want to own this. I want to control what people can do over this. And you can say this is what Apple does to some degree as well, about which apps can come into which app stores. But Apple claims they're doing this level of control in order to secure people and their devices. Facebook and Meta want to do that level of control so that they can provide the best service for their customers and whatnot, but really want to exploit you, But they want to set the rules.
Yeah.
And governments are just standing around saying, I remember a time when we used to set the rules and all
My
these
day.
things.
And I mean, the last vestiges, the last scream of governments doing that, in at least in the UK, has been TCN's technology capability notices, which is the kind of conversation we're having now. And I think other governments probably think it's a bit mad, but also keeping close eye on,
Yes.
I think. And basically it's a way of saying to a company, hey, your security's looking a bit too good. We would rather it wasn't. And handing over a notice which says, yes, you cannot do this capability, you cannot patch this vulnerability, you cannot do X, Y, or Z, which is the conversations that we're having now.
In my conversations with people who work in this space at very high levels, I'm not one of them. I just happen to talk to these people a lot. It's recognized that the UK government is the craziest person on the block. Crazier than even the governments that you think are the despotic government. Because they have the craziest demands against companies. And even, say, other governments who behave like the UK government, but are also democracies, even they're looking at the corner of their eye saying, who's this crazy person over there? But as you say, they're kind of hoping that the UK does well, because then they can introduce the same. And so the whole idea that a government wants the ability to issue a secret letter to the CEO of a company to say, you shall not do something that makes something secure, or you shall reduce the security of something that you provide to our people, so UK citizens, because we don't want UK people to have access. But importantly, these capabilities notices, as in this modern era, reintroduces the NSA key kind of concept, which is the UK intelligence agencies want this power so they can tell the Apples and the Metas and all these other companies about how they should be treating their clients in France, Germany, Iran, which is, we don't want them to have security, so we're going to use our power within the UK to assert that they can't have that. And so they're trying to reintroduce insecurity because, again, these had this power up until the 1990s and they miss it.
But it comes back to that 1990s view of the internet, which is, if I can tell Apple, don't release your next update because it's too good, then surely the American government will be like, I mean, maybe not the American government, because the American government can ring up the UK and be like, Five Eyes, baby, give us your information. Yeah. But there is no geo-locking. Like, there's no way it can only affect one group of people. And there's also no way it can only be accessible to governments. I don't know if it's just that governments think that their security agencies are a lot more advanced than they are as compared to companies. Because there used to be more of a gulf, right? There used to be, most technology came primarily through military routes. It was developed for military reasons. It was developed in military labs. It was developed in America. What was the American agency that funded MAD? ARPA, and so on. Like, the military had a hand in most things, GPS, for example, the internet, and that's no longer the case. But I wonder if in their heads they're like, well, MI6 and MI5's like capability to hack is so much better than, I don't know, fancy theirs. It's not, but I don't know if that's where it comes from.
It does. And the idea that there's a monopoly of knowledge and that a vulnerability discovered by the UK intelligence agency can't possibly be discovered by a teenager in North Korea.
Yeah.
But lo and behold, it does. But then, and exactly where you got to in that is where we are now, which is the military is back in vogue. Defense spending is back in vogue. The defense industry that were, had a hard time hiring people because everybody wanted to go work for Google and Facebook are now back in vogue because there's global conflict. And so for the next 10 to 15 years, they're probably going to be as strong as they were before, which is determining the future of innovation.
But also Google and those companies have been slightly not changing tack, but widening tack to take on defense contracts.
Yes.
Like is it Project Dragonfly a couple of years ago where there were massive Google walkouts because there was this, I can't remember what it did.
Project Maven was also another one. There was the Jedi project, contracting the Department of Defense. It should these big tech companies that were all like in your pocket because they're friendly and lovely and they don't do evil, should they be providing services to intelligence agencies? Should they be providing the backbone for the Department of Defense, U.S. Department of Defense drone warfare?
That's what it was.
In that case, yes. And then we discovered that Amazon provides cloud services for intelligence agencies.
Which, of course they do.
Of course.
It's like they're the biggest cloud provider in the world. Of course they do. But from government perspective, or from the ways that technology move into military spaces, almost the direction has shifted quite a lot, because before it was heavily controlled. It came through the innovation came from the government, and now the innovation's coming in the other direction. It's like when Clearview pops up in military areas, Clearview didn't come from government military spending that we're aware of, or that I'm aware of, but it still pops up. And other companies are slightly more complicated because Palantir got, CIA
Seed
funding
and whatnot.
Yeah.
Then you have Starlink being used by the Ukrainians to aim their drones, and then Elon Musk shutting it down because he didn't want to get in trouble with the Russians.
It's like there are no clean lines anymore, and there are no hierarchical lines anymore in a way that is very complicated and difficult, but
and
isn't
I just
the top
pray
of the
that, going back to my dream of how the National Security Agency in the U.S. is supposed to conduct itself, my dream is that governments will remember that their duty isn't just to wage war and exploit the rights of people around the world, but it is, I don't even like that to begin with, but they also have a duty to secure the rights of their citizens and the people within their countries. And in a globalized world, I want that blurring, which is you can't just secure the rights of people living in Britain without actually securing the rights of people living in Morocco.
Yeah.
And I want that recognition. And that's the world I'm imagining we live in. Governments still live in this bunker mentality that we have control and we can determine the rights of people differently based on what their passport says, what their ID card says, or the color of their skin.
Fun times.
Who would have thought this had all come from the crypto wars? Yeah, the reason I'm so tired of the crypto wars, just to close this all off, is ridiculously I was given a PhD for my study of cryptography policy and the crypto wars and looking at the challenges of regulating tech. And this is the kind of knowledge I apply to this day, because when you look at something in detail like that, control is really hard to exert. But equally, it's not like when the crypto wars were won that all of a sudden the world flipped to a highly secure world. No. We had a long battle to go still, and we got to this point where yay, encryption, WhatsApp, blah, 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 but there's still insecurity everywhere. It's a nonstop battle, and I love that.
Well, it's a conversation you've been having for 30 years. Yeah. I think everyone gets a bit sort of sick of a conversation if it's been going on 30 years.
Exactly.
But yeah, well, that thus ends our series on encryption. If you have any more questions or things you want us to cover,
ask Caitlin.
Then ask me. But you can email us at info@privacyinternational.org. At some point, I'll put back up the survey that we had, and you can fill that back up again. For anyone who did fill it out when we still had it up, I appreciate you very much. And I read all of your responses. Most people said they wish the podcast came up more often. And to you, I apologize, but I don't think that's going to happen. Oh. But yeah, anyway, as a side note, thank you for listening.
Yeah, thanks for listening to me talk and talk and talk and talk. Remember, you can sign up to be the first to learn more about our work at pvcy.org/podsignup. And we'll include some links to the relevant articles and information in the description wherever you're listening, or on our website at pvcy.org/techpill. Don't forget to rate and subscribe to the podcast on whichever platform you use. Music courtesy of Sepia. This podcast was produced by Max Burnell for Privacy International.